Andrea Henry, and she has enjoyed working professionally in the field of healthcare interpreting for over 25 years. Most of those years have been in the face-to-face interpreting of dialogue in both adult and children's healthcare setting. Interpreting on the front lines is her biggest joy. Andrea's areas of interest and expertise include specializations such as pediatric cancer, pediatric heart defects, etc. Outside of the box methods for navigating technical speech and sociolinguistic bumps and value-added scripting for improving encounter interaction. You can see her full bio on the program. She has done some additional work on, cognitive overload and stress and, during interpreting and so on. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you, Lola. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to share one screen, just one part of a PowerPoint. Let's see. And at the very least, okay. Is that up there?
Oh, yes. Whoops. Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Gosh, that was incredible. Both Justine and Lena, or Lana, is it Lena? That was absolutely wonderful. I'm really excited to be here. I'll just get started. I'm a tad nervous, but I'll just briefly remind you that I am a staff interpreter. I work at a pediatric level 1 trauma center. I do research on my downtime, so I'm a full-time interpreter. And like Lola just mentioned, I've been in the field for 27 years. 6 years of those were in management. Somewhere between 4 and 5 were in freelance interpreting. I did 1 year full-time over the phone interpreting at Pacific Interpreters headquarters in Portland, Oregon. About the last 20, I've been at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and 18 of those years has been in face-to-face full-time interpreting. So hopefully that will give you a sense of where I'm coming from. But I wanted to start with the research, and I want to give you a sense of what we've done at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory, and then also some of the outgrowths or some of the unexpected things we learned that did ultimately give us information about how to protect our performance in the interpreted encounter, how to mitigate mental fatigue, and how to make that contribute to a more accurate performance. So I'll start with the research. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory University, we've partnered together to develop and validate a tool that assesses complexity and interpreter mental fatigue. We're an interdisciplinary team, which includes Dr. Courtney McCracken and Dr. Scott Gillespie. They're our statisticians. Kathy Murphy is my co-PI, or my co-principal investigator. She's a clinical nurse specialist in the congenital cardiac defects unit in our cardiology center. And then there's me, a staff interpreter. And I interpret for about 5 to 10 families a day, and maybe a minimum of about 10 different specialties or service lines a day in the hospital. But overall, all of us interpreters at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta are navigating about 60 different potential specialties and service lines. So it's a lot of different lexicons and a lot of different goals for each one of those specialists. But the tool we developed and validated is called the CFIE tool. And CFIE is an acronym that stands for complexity and fatigue in interpreted encounters. It's not a burnout tool. It doesn't assess accumulated mental fatigue or compassion fatigue, but it was designed to assess the demands on concentration or cognitive load and effort during the encounter and the corresponding mental fatigue. Its original intent, and this I could blame Natalie Kelly for this, she put an email out years and years ago asking everyone on the NCHC listserv what we all do in our respective hospitals to understand workload with interpreters. How are we looking at their productivity? Are they busy enough? Are they too busy? What are we doing? And this is kind of where it started. But the tools, the original intent from that email and everything that evolved after that. The intent was to aid managers and administrators in assessing the actual mental gymnastics aspect of an interpreter's work, not just time spent. And our plan was initially to create a metric that assesses mental fatigue and yields a score that could be integrated into the interpreter productivity. Again, not just time spent. And it's meant to add rigor to the calculation of workload and essentially help with the perennial question that management has and interpreters, not just staff, but freelancers as well. The perennial question of what is an appropriate workload for effective performance. And so the tool was developed over several years with content garnered from about 4 focus groups, 24 interpreters, and an anonymous survey with 32 interpreters. And the content and layout were finalized, and it was copyrighted for Emory University and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta in 2017. And then we validated it with 24 interpreters at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta in 2018 and 2020. And both cohorts, both groups used the tool following approximately 1,600 interpreted encounters. And incidentally, all of those encounters were face-to-face. They were all navigated by Spanish-English interpreters. And we found that our hypothesis was correct, that certain scores would be associated with higher mental fatigue and mental effort. We then externally validated the tool, which is just another way to say we had other interpreters at other hospitals across the states use the tool. So we had 3 different facilities agree to let their interpreters participate if they wanted to. And that was Boston. One of the facilities was in Boston, another one in Cincinnati, and another one in San Antonio. We ended up with a much more diverse group. A total of 43 interpreters, 8 different language pairs were represented, and they were interpreting at all these centers, these 3 different centers in all 3 modalities. They were doing face-to-face, video or VRI, and OPI, and they used the CFIE, or they used that metric following 2,300 interpreted encounters. And again, our main hypothesis was proven correct. That was very exciting, that certain scores would be associated with higher mental fatigue. So our statistician, Dr. McCracken, she looked at the literature and found that there are 3 key causes of mental fatigue. And it's important to think about why is this something that matters to an interpreter? Why does it matter that we measure it, and what exactly is it? The first cause would be continual mental effort without a break. Sounds a lot like interpreting, whether or not it's consecutive or simultaneous. Excessive attention on a particular task, which is very much hypervigilance, very much what we do, and high levels of stress or emotion. And just to back up for a minute, or back up for a second, it's good to think about what healthcare interpreting is. So we're kind of unique, but the basics are that we are doing dialogue interpreting. It's almost entirely discourse, almost entirely bidirectional, and consecutive with some simultaneous, just depending on the circumstances and the characteristics of the encounter. And it requires exceptional short-term memory skills. It's all memorization when it's consecutive. It also requires incredible proficiency in approximately 60 different specialties, like I mentioned, which have all kinds of different types of encounters. They could be diagnostic, treatment-related, side effects-related. And there's a multitude of potential vernaculars and regional distinctions of the patients and caregivers that we're interpreting for as well. And then we're also working with language discordant families. So that creates an added complexity for the interpreter. And then it also requires us to be dealing with unpredictable speech.
Andrea, sorry for interrupting you. Are you switching the slides, or are you on slide 2 still?
I'm just going to leave it on that title slide, if that's where I left it. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, I kind of wanted to leave it right here. I'm so sorry.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And then in addition to just remembering that we're doing dialogue interpreting and it being bidirectional, we're also dealing with entirely unpredictable speech. We don't get the content ahead of time. We don't generally get materials ahead of time. We don't even necessarily know what the conversation is going to be. We don't know the goals of each party. We don't necessarily know the potential reactions of each party. We don't know until we get there. We don't know the who, what, why, or for how long. So unpredictability is a key stressor for healthcare interpreters. And it also requires the ability to participate in a very emotionally charged interaction. It is healthcare. We're not selling a product. It's not academic, and it's not geopolitical, which has its own stressors. It's really people's quality of life, potentially a life and death conversation, just things being radically changed in the way they live their life because of their own health issue or because of a family member's health issue. And they could potentially be hostile to one another while we're interpreting. They could be hostile towards the interpreter. And the subjects themselves can be quite provocative or triggering to the interpreter. And these are all things that we deal with. And it can be done in all three modalities, face-to-face, VRI, and OPI. Now, what the research yielded was a very well-performing tool, which is very exciting. If you know how many years we've worked on this, you would understand why it feels good to be done. We just did something that was a little unusual, and it required a lot of expert opinion, expert skill, people helping us understand how to get this done and get it done right. And we do plan to share it once it's been published, and it will be free and it will be digital. But the research also yielded an awareness that we need more than just workload metrics. My initial goal, like I mentioned, was if we could just help interpreters understand that their job is so much more complex than the minutes that they're interpreting. Like each one of those minutes is potentially quite complicated. And if we can help managers justify their positions and have a much more rigorous method for getting new positions approved, then this field would be a much better place for most of us to start a career and stay in it. But we realized that it was a lot more with the conversations we've had with people across the country. We've realized there's an incredible need to reduce mental fatigue with strategies and improve performance, in addition to improving staffing. We need improved workflow standards and enhanced staffing models to reduce mental fatigue and improve performance. And we need to normalize things like the Pomodoro technique and understanding brain breaks for interpreters and make that a more standardized process instead of interpreters feeling guilt for not being able to maintain an optimal performance because of the circumstances and the mental fatigue in that particular encounter. Some of the other unexpected lessons, which if you've ever done research, you know this, but if you haven't done research and you want to do it, it's amazing when you go in completely blind and you have no idea what to expect. We found a lot of unexpected things from this research and from the incredible amount of data and the consistent patterns, but we found that VRI, because the tool was tested with VRI, same interpreters doing the OPI and face-to-face, but VRI was severely fatiguing. Nobody expected that. Of course, everything that like Justine had mentioned, some of the issues with auditory problems certainly seem to be, information we were getting, but we really don't know all the different reasons why, but it was considered severely fatiguing. Statisticians that analyzed the work shared that. We've got all kinds of graphs to show that. But OPI was also more fatiguing than face-to-face. And face-to-face, ironically, ended up being a bit of an intervention for some of the hospitals that did participate. They ended up having some of their interpreters go back to face-to-face, or having more of a proportion of their day being face-to-face than VRI to make up for some of that fatigue, or at least try to mitigate it. We also found that the pre-session, establishing the rules and hoping for a dialogue that is easily manageable for the interpreter, the pre-session did not guarantee less fatigue. That was a surprise. We found that much of the time when someone did admit to using a pre-session, which we did offer a standardized approach to what we considered a pre-session for the research, it was associated with more fatigue. So that again was a bit of a surprise. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do pre-sessions. It just means we should probably lower our expectations. People are human, and talking is messy, especially dialogue between providers and patients in emotionally charged encounters. We also found that different departments had different levels of fatigue associated with them. So in talking with administrators and interpreter colleagues across the country, we also found that working conditions are currently not necessarily conducive to high performance. Pay, in terms of how we're compensated across the country, is not necessarily conducive to retaining talent. A lot of places are paying, if they publish, and you can look at this online, a lot of their pay range is equivalent to a customer service rep. So, they just don't understand what we're doing. We often don't understand what we're doing. I do believe we can move the needle on this by incorporating language acquisition into the compensation equation. Our pay range should reflect the 5 to 8 years of academic credit for having learned a second language, regardless of how it was learned. That could impact things positively. We could also greatly benefit from a pay analysis, like Dr. CHAE had done. He's at the Harvard School of Economics, and he looked at compensation for Medicare for different providers and the services they were using. And he used a bit of a rubric to come up with fair pay, fair compensation by Medicare. And that was looking at the job itself from the standpoint of judgment, the kind of judgment you need to do that job, mental effort, physical effort, stress, technical skills, and time spent. And that would be a wonderful thing for healthcare interpreters, to have somebody out there be willing to pay for that kind of a study. And then also the other thing that we learned was that healthcare interpreters are pretty undervalued and misunderstood. And there's a need to look at why that is. What is it we can do as interpreters to advocate for ourselves, and what is it our managers can do and administrators and our leaders can do to improve the messaging out there about what it is we're actually doing. It is not just speaking Arabic and being nice. It's not just, that Andrea speaks Spanish and she's so very friendly. Sadly, I think a lot of the time we're viewed in that way, and I think we could change that. Also, the other thing we learned is there's a need to improve the vetting process with interpreters, improve on-the-job preparation and precepting, professional opportunities for learning, not exclusively vocabulary. Again, it's dialogue. It's quite messy. We need a lot of social skills and scripting, and provide more coaching by expert interpreter practitioners. And we also learned that uncontrolled mental fatigue can lead to burnout and interpreters leaving the field or leaving the front lines. And the 27 years I've been in the field, I've seen a lot of incredible interpreters leave the front lines because of working conditions and because of pay. I think we can change that. And I think if we could change, at the very least, working conditions and staffing models, we could maybe start with that and then move towards pay. And then we also learned that the environment, the parties, the players, the circumstances, the goals of the encounter, all of those, they're all very different characteristics depending on where we are, what we're doing, who the parties are. That can impact mental effort and fatigue in unique ways, and pay should reflect that. Just like with nursing, ICU nurses are staffed differently than clinic nurses. They're also paid differently than clinic nurses from the standpoint of the complexity of the work. So even though the CFIE tool was designed to serve as that missing piece to productivity, we ended up finding a lot of strategies that could help interpreters. And I'm going to go through the strategies and explain a few. And then if anyone has any questions, I can certainly send you information or share more with the question and answer section. But one thing to do prior, so I have pre-encounter strategies or things to do before you start the interpretation, what to do during the interpretation, and after. All of them are designed to improve your performance by taking into consideration the fact that many things do deplete our mental gas tank, and we have some amount of control to keep that from happening or to actually recover our gas tank. So some of the pre-encounter strategies include perspective taking, knowing yourself, doing a burst of physical exercise, not a full 30 minutes necessarily, a burst, and I'll tell you why. And then getting the content ahead of time, if you can, or at the very least at the door, if you are a face-to-face interpreter, or prior to the interpretation over the phone, or if it is video, to ask what the goal of the encounter is. And then also setting the stage, preparing for traffic control by informing parties of what your practice is. Again, we have to think about it from the standpoint of discourse. And 2 people talking with each other, or 10 people in a care conference, they don't tend to follow the rules. They don't tend to give each other time to speak. They tend to talk over each other. And as an interpreter, it can be quite tough to be fully accurate and complete when people can't seem to give you those breaks. Sorry, my little alarm's going off. How many minutes do I have, Lola?
You have a minute and a half.
Okay. Fabulous. And then, like, one thing I mentioned with setting the stage and preparing for traffic control with dialogue is using a sign. Kudo has a wonderful screen sign that reminds speakers to slow down. With interpreting and dialogue, especially face-to-face, you can tell them in advance, especially if you're prepared for the fact that it might be a 2-hour care conference or a 90-minute teaching on bone marrow transplants. You might let them know that you will be using a sign. If you create it or use your hand, if you let them know in advance, that can reduce the stress, and reducing stress reduces mental fatigue, which will maintain some of your gas tank. There are all kinds of things you can do. And then during the encounter, I highly recommend sitting. I bring my own chair everywhere all day long. It's a cute little camping type stool that I can put over my shoulder, and I bring it to every encounter. It enables me to keep my blood in my brain and not in my feet. But it also helps me create some physical alignment with the parties in the room, which is good from the social aspect of what dialogue is. It also helps because I'm tall, and if I'm standing over people, then they have to strain their neck. I also recommend position changes. A lot of interpreters, especially newer ones, worry about changing positions halfway through an encounter. I'm a huge proponent for just getting what you need for your performance. And so if you need to move. Mode change, switch from consecutive to simultaneous, or if you've started in simultaneous, switch to consecutive. For me, when it's consecutive and it's long, like an extended meeting with maybe 15 people at a table, I've been interpreting, memorizing long chunks of information for a long time, and at a certain point I can't. And I switch to simultaneous, and I might let everybody know, excuse me, I'm going to just go ahead and start whisper interpreting, depending on who I'm sitting next to. It all requires me to be right next to the person who's listening. Many times I'm right next to the parents. I work in a pediatric center, but I will start to do whisper interpreting because I can no longer hold on to that much information accurately. And I comfortably do that, but it's taken me years to get to the point where I know I need to do it, and I know how to let everybody know that I'm doing it. And then I also recommend stepping away. If you've gotten to a point where you know you're making mistakes, it's been too long, it's been one heck of a complex encounter, you can step away, just be polite, go to the bathroom, whatever you do, don't ask for water because they'll bring it to you and you'll say, oh, thanks. Even though what you really needed was to get out of the room for a moment and do a burst of exercise. You can go to an individual bathroom. This is my best advice to most people, and shut the door, turn the light off, and get a brain break that way, or jump around, get some physical activity, and comfortably take a good 10 minutes. When you say you're going to the bathroom, there is nothing anyone can do to even judge you for that. Most people, in fact, will decide it's time for them to go to the bathroom too. That is my best strategy for stepping away when you know that your performance is degraded. And then, of course, sharing that workload with your colleagues. If you do have the privilege of working in a facility where you've got other colleagues with you, absolutely rely on them so that you can, after whatever amount of time you've been in that room, have someone come and relieve you. And we do have that system at Children's. We do have a dispatching system, and we have a fairly efficient way of saying, take me out of the game, coach. I am no longer functioning at an acceptable level of performance. And then I have a bunch more strategies that I don't have time to share, but I'm thinking am I out of time, Lola?
Yeah.
Okay.
we
And
can
then I'll say one more thing, and then I will stop. For after the encounter, and I do this, and I'm not necessarily a person who loves to exercise, but I do for many of the same reasons that Lena just shared. But I do bursts of exercise before and after really tough encounters, but almost always after a tough encounter. You can't always predict that it's going to be tough. And when my brain hurts, I do go to the gym. We have a tiny little gym at the hospital, and I will go down there for whatever amount of time I've got before they send me to the next assignment. And that sometimes is just 5 minutes, but it does make a difference. And it's in the research and green space. The Kaplans researched this. Green space is more effective at recovering brain energy and helping you with decision making in addition to the burst of physical exercise. Both of those have been proven in research to improve cognition. So I highly recommend them. And like I said, I use the burst more than green space. I don't have much green space at work. But thank you. I will finish now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I could see the wealth of information, strategies, and tips that you have provided that interpreters need to rewatch the session to really apply what you have shared. So thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful piece.